One of the newer design capabilities you have now in Azure is to be able to use availability zones within your application architecture. So let's take a look at a practical example. So let's say that you have a web application, you've got a domain registered like globalmantics.com, and that's registered at DNS somewhere. And check out this architecture that we have here. We've got an Azure load balancer, we've got some web servers, and then we've got an Azure SQL database. So a basic setup to provide access to a web application running on some virtual machines. Now in this model, what we can do is we can have people go to globalmantics.com that can resolve to the Azure load balancer. And there's basically a paid tier on the Azure load balancer that allows you to span multiple availability zones within a single region. So here you can see we've got the central US region. That's currently one of the regions that supports availability zones. And by the time you watch this video, there may be a support for many other regions. There's a couple right now, but you'll want to check the documentation and check in the portal, and I'll show you where to find this in the portal. But you can see that I've got a virtual machine in AZ1, so in availability zone 1 within central US, and I've got a virtual machine in AZ2 or availability zone 2 here in central US. So once again, the cool thing about this is those availability zones are connected via high-speed links. It kind of seems like to us, looking at things from the network perspective and from a bandwidth perspective, that those servers are in the same physical location, but they're actually in two different data centers in this case. And so the great thing is if we have a catastrophe that wipes out the data center here for availability zone 1, for example, the server in availability zone 2 is still there and running, and the load balancer can do a health check and determine that's the only server available. And of course, on the back end, if we're using something like Azure SQL database, which we'll talk about more detail later, we can actually have database replication, geo-replication, and we can have a copy of a database in a separate region for redundancy. So using availability zones with your virtual machines and some of the other services here in Azure that we'll take a look at is a great design consideration and a great design practice, because it gives you the ability to spread your resources out against physical locations within a single data center, or within a single region, I should say. Let's go ahead and hop over to the Azure portal, and I'll show you how you would actually use an availability zone when you're launching something like an Azure virtual machine. Okay, so back here in the Azure portal, let's say we go to create a resource. So we want to build a Windows virtual machine or a couple virtual machines to support a web application. When we get in here, we would fill out the common information like the resource group that we want to use. We'd put in the name of the virtual machine. What we're interested in this particular video is the availability options. Notice where it says no infrastructure redundancy required. So that might be something we would pick by default when we're just doing a quick test, but take a look at this. If we hit the drop-down list, we've got the availability set. So going back to the last video, we were talking about availability sets and building VMs in basically a single availability zone in a single region, or maybe building virtual machines in a region that doesn't have availability zones yet. That might be an interesting option. But then we've got availability zones. So let's pick that. You can see that as we build this virtual machine, it wants to know which availability zone we're going to pick. So here you can see there's availability zones 1, 2, and 3. And so I think the game plan for Microsoft here is to always have at least 2 availability zones in a region. Typically 3, I think, is kind of the goal. But again, availability zones are a very cool concept because it gives you the ability to easily and quickly build infrastructure across multiple physical data centers. But now that we understand availability zones a little bit better, let's move to the next video and we'll take a look at some other key services that support high availability natively here in the Azure platform.